subject of death and dying can be a very difficult conversation to have. Many of us avoid having the conversation because it makes us uncomfortable. We don't want to worry or upset our loved ones, and we really don't want to face tough questions or think about our own death. Having open conversations about death and dying allows us to prepare ourselves and our loved ones on how we would like to create our own end-of-life journey. On every episode of Guided Crossings, we will explore a different part of the dying process and offer suggestions on how to prepare your loved ones as well as yourself. I'm your host, Andrea Sebastyan, and this is Guided Crossings.
There is an increasing interest in green burials and many questions surrounding what exactly a green burial entails. My guest today is Lee Webster, a leading advocate for green burials. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
I was just kind of curious because it seems to be a new trend of having a green burial. Can you explain a little bit about what a green burial is?
Sure. What we're really looking at is burial without impediment. That's really all we're talking about for the most part. There, we can get into the weeds, I'm sure we will. But the essentials are that we bury naturally, which is why we also call it natural burial. Green sort of, talks about being eco-friendly, whereas natural describes the actual process of putting the body in the ground without vaults, without steel or hardwood caskets, burying at the appropriate level, which is about 3.5 to 4 feet. And in most cases, what we're hoping is that people will go without embalming because we don't want those chemicals in the ground as well. So that's the basics of it.
When you do a green burial and not a conventional lawn burial, what are some of the main differences?
Yeah, those are the main differences when we're talking at a very fundamental level. And we're talking about three different types of cemeteries. So we're talking different cemeteries. So what's different is going to depend on which type of cemetery you're being buried in. So in the one that we see here most in New Hampshire and Vermont and Massachusetts is a lawn cemetery, usually municipally owned and operated. And we call those hybrid cemeteries, where we're able to use a portion of the land for vaultless burial. So they might still mow the lawn, they might still do all those things, but they're going to ask that there be no vault, no concrete vault or other type of liner, and that you use a biodegradable container. So that's the basics.
Okay, so when you talk about a green burial or a natural burial, is there and I know there's a difference obviously with a cremation, but how do you decide the green burial is a safer or a more environmentally friendly way to go?
Ooh, that's a lot of statistics that I'm not going to spew to you right now. But essentially, what we've been doing, the way that we've been doing conventional burial, is that we are putting tons and tons of concrete in the ground. And then that has its own carbon footprint in being manufactured. We're putting in hardwoods from South America that have, again, big footprint getting here and then manufacturing it. And they don't biodegrade properly. Using steel, of course, that's not going to biodegrade, all of that kind of thing. So those are the environmental issues, sort of the standard environmental issues we associate with conventional burial. Cremation, we're looking at a whole other overuse of fossil fuels. We're also looking at things being emitted into the atmosphere, mercury that goes up into the sky and comes down in our waterways, and we're talking about phosphorus runoff when these are scattered on the ground in dense. They're very heavy and dense, and they're essentially they're not ashes as people like to think.
Well, that's the thing.
They're phosphorus, calcium, and salt. So this is not good either for the plants that you're dumping them on or for the soil that you might be burying them in. So there's some real drawbacks to both of these sort of standard issue disposition options.
And I think, I just learned so much about a cremation because I thought, like most people, I'm sure, it's ashes. And, you just put it, and I think everyone wants to scatter them, but some people do bury the urns. And again, depending on what sort of urn you choose, it could be not a safe environmental choice, right?
Well, it is the fact that it's pulverized bone, so those final elements after they've been incinerated just can't be used by the soil or by any plant material. They're dangerous, in fact, to those, not to us, just to the plants, the environment.
And I mean, somehow it all trickles, right? So a question that I had while we're talking about this was, so I guess there are some misconceptions about a natural burial. And one of the things that I kind of thought of that was kind of a little bit questionable was, say someone has passed, they want a green burial, and they had a lot of cancer. And so they had a lot of chemo, and they had a lot of medications and things. And so when they're buried and their body's decomposing, is that a risk for things? And then if you look at to the environment and the soil and that sort of thing, and then if you look at that from if someone was cremated and they had cancer and the same stuff, when they're cremated, do they have that same possibility of those medications and things in them?
Okay, yeah.
It's a big question.
It's a good one, and I'll try to make it as simple as possible.
Please.
The danger around chemotherapy, mainly radiotherapy, radiation treatments that people receive if they have cancer, specifically breast cancer or prostate cancer. When those seeds are activated by radiation, and then someone dies quickly, they go to the crematory. The crematory operator is actually at increased risk of being exposed to this. So it's dangerous to the crematory operator.
Okay.
Otherwise, there's nothing. It's going to be incinerated.
Okay.
But burial, when we're talking about burying someone who has just gone through this is the miracle of soil, is that it acts as a filter, and anything that is in that body, whatever heavy metals that we all accumulate through our lifetime, whether or not we were treated for something like cancer with those types of drugs, those are all going to be captured and taken up. Any nutrients in the body are going to be taken up by plant life, by the insects that arrive, and then the fungi that arrives. So all of these things naturally work to keep that body right in place, use what's usable, and bind everything else. So those things are not dangerous in the ground.
Right, right. It's interesting because you mentioned, the cremator operator type thing. What about with a typical, not necessarily lawn burial, but a death that you don't choose, the more traditional, let's say, burial? What are some of the risks to, like, the morticians who are working on the bodies and things?
The greatest...
For a traditional one, sorry,
right.
Not the green, let's be clear, not the green burial.
Correct. Yeah, the major problem for embalmers and funeral directors who embalm, it's not the same thing.
Okay.
But it gets us to the same place. They're exposed to formaldehyde for the most part, but there are other things that are also in your standard formaldehyde-based embalming fluid. And that actually we have been able to study over time and discovered that funeral directors, as a result of being exposed to this, have generally a 13% higher rate of early death compared to the general population. They have 4 times, I think, higher risk of Lou Gehrig's disease, and also myeloid leukemia, 8 times the percent of the general population that contracts myeloid leukemia. And then we're also looking at other Parkinson's disease, neurological diseases. There's a high risk here. So all of these chemicals in a traditional embalming, what the funeral industry considers traditional.
Right.
It's,
yes.
About 100 years old.
But that's exactly it, right? Because a green burial is sort of, or a natural burial is sort of, I know it's happened way back when, that's how they used to do it, but it sort of didn't stay, it's becoming more popular. I think people are more interested in pursuing other options?
Well, they're certainly more interested in not having invasive procedures done to the body after a person has died. And we're also changing the way that we're managing the funerals itself, the time from the death to the disposition, not just what the disposition choice is. Those are two different things. People are often confused when they think about funerals. So for my purposes, I'm talking about from the moment that person dies until they go to that final resting place. And what's going to happen during that period, and how are we going to ensure that if that person wanted an ecologically friendly funeral and disposition option, that we can give that to them. So it is perfectly legal for people to not be embalmed and to stay home. Your loved one, in fact, your next of kin is the person who is in charge, has what the state of New Hampshire calls custody and control of the body. So we can, and I have witnessed many of these, including my own relatives, where we just keep the loved one home and we don't do anything invasive or chemical to them before they go to their final.
It's interesting because we used to live in South Carolina. And so I was born and raised, short story, Montreal and Quebec. And so there, you still had the traditional 3 days of it being exposed. And then, they would close the casket and then you'd go to the cemetery and there'd be a burial and that sort of thing. And then when we moved to South Carolina, we were shocked the first funeral that we attended because it was someone in their home, their parlor, as a setup. And I was just like, huh. And, I didn't really question it because I was like, that was their tradition per se, and that's how that went. But it's interesting that that's sort of making a comeback almost here in New Hampshire.
It is worldwide. More and more families are taking on the responsibility for their own family members and for their funerals. And a lot of this has to do with, if I can go off on a little bit of a tangent.
Sure. Please.
part of what's happened over all these years, where we've been encasing bodies in these, these caskets, and we're embalming them so that they're no longer, going to decay in the way that nature intended, and we're putting, a box within a box. All of these things are ways that we have been disassociating ourselves from the death of our loved one. And what we're doing now is we're bringing that back. We're saying, you know what, we need to stop being afraid of the death. I shouldn't be any more afraid of my loved one from the moment that they died until after they died. And we're starting to come to grips with that. We have a lot of younger generations who are saying, what's this going on? Why are we doing it this way? It's not environmentally friendly, it's not affordable, and it doesn't add to the meaning of being present when our loved ones die. And taking the reins for at least some. Some people choose not to do all, so they'll have blended funerals where they hire a funeral director to do pieces and parts that feel more comfortable to them. But people tend to be slowing things down, spending more time with their loved one after the death, allowing people to come and be near them. And we have a big rise in home burials. It's also legal to bury in your own property if you're in rural areas. We're a rural state. You want to check with your local zoning about that. But I only know of one place in the whole state of New Hampshire right now that doesn't allow it. But it is this is fairly common, and it's this seamless moment, especially if someone was on hospice, to move from hospice care right into after death care, and then on into burial on their own property. This costs very little. There's no real downside to it at all. It's very easy to complete paperwork and all the things that you have to do. So I think what we're doing, what you're seeing, because this on the rise thing, is many, many years of people saying, hold on, let's reevaluate, let's see what we can do that makes the most sense to us and our family and our community. And I love it that you were in South Carolina, because the first natural burial cemetery in the U.S. was established at Ramsey Creek in South Carolina.
Oh, look at that!
And they've been setting the tone for the rest. We are over 360 that I know about. I keep a master list,
so over 360 statewide, like in the entire U.S.
Canada,
okay. I didn't know if that was okay.
Of natural burial spaces, and again, those are spaces that are municipal or religious owned. So they're small. They're whoever was there, historic cemeteries who may not have had vaults either, because vaults only started in the 1930s or so.
Okay.
But then we've also got other types of cemeteries that are springing up. Natural cemeteries, which are cemeteries that are just for the purpose of burying naturally. And then conservation level cemeteries, where we will have a land trust that's involved, so that we have more and more support to keep that land, save that land, preserve that land, restore that land. Lots of restoration projects and so on go on there. Those are going to look and feel different, the experience of being on them. But the basics are there. It's a question of how much the family and friends and the community want to become involved, and they have that opportunity with these types of burials.
Interesting. So a green burial, is it, or natural burial, is it like all denominations you're seeing it, all ethnic groups and things like that? Like people are...
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is one of the keys to, from my point of view, this is one of the keys to the success of natural burial, is that we're looking at this not just from we're going to run a cemetery and we're not going to allow a vault. We're looking at it as a place to establish and to reinforce social justice, environmental justice practices, so that everyone, regardless of their accessibility to other types of nature experiences, will have them there. We're building in things like trailways that where we have wheelchair accessible. We have for the visually impaired, we have braille signage, this type of thing. We're using QR codes and GPS units to so that when people come to the grave, they can use a smartphone and they can pick up the video or pictures or music about that loved one.
Really?
So we have different ways that we're trying to open it up.
Right.
We're also trying to use these spaces for more life-affirming activities. In fact, we have, if you talk to Billy Campbell at Ramsey Creek in South Carolina, he'll tell you that they do as many weddings and baby baptisms as they do funerals on their property.
Wow.
More and more people are coming here to do educational events, wildlife, wildflower identification types of things, all kinds of community events. So we're turning cemeteries back to what they were before the lawn cemetery, where they were places where people met, communities, families, and so this is an enriching experience. It's not just about being buried green.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I was going to ask, can you do like a headstone? But I guess you do field stones to mark the grave. It's not, and then the parties, the baptisms and the celebrations, you can almost feel like your loved one is still with you. I think that's,
yes.
A huge deal for a lot of people, because just seeing some of the ways I experience funerals and things like that, it almost felt like a disconnect until someone had a eulogy where they brought that person in and you talked about that person. Otherwise, it's just the ceremony type thing, whereas this sounds like it can be really done personally for what the person either talked about it before, what they want, or the family can decide collectively what would be the best thing. Could you go through a ceremony? What are the steps?
Because I was just going to say, that's the next thing to tell you about.
Yeah.
I do want to say that remind people that it is up to them to create their own ceremonies, whether they use a funeral director or not.
Okay.
That doesn't change. The family is always in charge. So this is, but what happens here is that we have more opportunity. People kind of step out a little bit more. And what happens in most of these, and I'll describe, we already know what happens in a sort of a municipal cemetery. You can usually drive up and that type of thing. In a natural cemetery, what's going to happen is that we're not driving all over the property. We have trailways. Often, as I say, they're wide enough. We can bring the casket in or the shroud in on a golf cart or some other kind of a conveyance, wheeled conveyance, or people can carry in. So what happens is that people meet in the parking lot and the experience begins there. And the cemetery operator is going to be very involved also in assisting the family. There are still funeral directors there. There's clergy there. We're not removing anything. We're even including military honors, all of those things. There's nothing that gets lost in this. It gets enhanced.
Okay,
So what we're doing is bringing back the procession. So bringing a procession through. And one of the things that can happen, doesn't have to, but can happen during that time, is that you stop at different stations on the way to the gravesite and do a poem or have some music or whatever. So this becomes part of the experience, and it's that transition from day-to-day life into this liminal time, this special time that you're spending with this community of people that you're experiencing this with. You get up to the gravesite, and that will be prepared already. And again, a ceremony can occur there just the way that it would any other way in any other place. It's just that your cathedral now is the trees or the meadow, or in the West, of course, we've got prairies and so on. So it's not, it's wherever the grave space can be located. And so whatever happens there is going to happen there. Usually what will happen after that is that the body will be lowered into the grave, which we've lined with biomass, which can be very beautiful. Flowers, different types of greenery, so that it's sort of putting someone to bed.
Right.
We then cover that with some greenery as well, and this helps us in a science way. It helps us because we're creating an oxygen trap there, which will aid in the decomposition process as it goes. Everything will be natural. The family and friends are welcome to just throw a bit of dirt on, but we have a whole lot of shovels, including ones for little kids. And those kids really love it. They go to town. It's filling that grave is their job.
Right.
It becomes a therapeutic aspect.
I think it's a good grief way of grieving. I think it's just another, like a closure, but in a way where you feel like you're participating, as opposed to then someone else is coming to do everything.
Right. Yeah. And we're not looking at indoor-outdoor carpet or anything, although some still use hydraulic lifts and stuff. But for the most part, families want to get into this. They want to really put their backs into it. It's physical. Grief, we forget, is not in the brain.
Yeah.
It's in the body too. Yeah. And this gives you an opportunity to work through that.
Right.
So that's kind of the way that all works. When we're done, then we mound all the soil, and then we'll put more greenery over the top or something, to hold it in place and allow it to simply settle on its own. What we found in natural burial cemeteries, though, is that families don't just come back for Memorial Day. They come back all the time. They get to know other families who are there. That's how the community building works as well.
Right.
So there's an invitation and a welcoming in these places that we tend not to feel when we're looking at rows and rows of block granite kind of thing.
Right. Something that I was kind of curious about, how long when a person has passed can you then have a natural or a green burial? So like if they die, say on a Saturday or something, there's a week, because the body isn't being preserved?
Well, the body is being preserved.
Okay.
I think this is one of the misunderstandings that a lot of people have about this.
Okay.
The fact is that for, since the beginning of time, the thing that has slowed down the decomposition process is temperature.
Okay.
So if we keep the body cool,
that's true. Yeah.
We have no problem. So we can use dry ice. We can use a cool room. Open the window this time of year or later. That does the job just fine. We usually try to bury within about 3 days, but you can go longer than that. At 3 days is when you start to go, I think it's time.
Right.
But prior to that, it's really not an issue. Cleanliness and cool temperatures do the job just fine.
So we're in a state that has 4 seasons. And winter can be challenging. Can you bury a green burial? Can you have a natural burial in the winter?
You could, if your cemetery allows it.
Okay. How many cemeteries here in New Hampshire offer green burials?
Pretty much, from what I've been able to gather, a lot that are below the mid-state line, because there's not always that much snow.
Oh, right.
And they have products called grave warmers where you can actually go in and warm up the iced in areas, the frost areas. They don't cost much. It's pretty easy to do. There are 3 states in the Midwest that don't allow cemeteries to close in the winter. So, if they can do it, we could be doing it. It's just that we've chosen not to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then it's sort of like a February to not February, March sort of thing to October type thing, or as long as the first frost, like that sort of thing?
Yeah, if that's the way your cemetery works. So that's part of the work that I do, is try to get other people to go out and advocate locally with their cemetery trustees. We vote them in here in New Hampshire every March,
Right.
and we need to tell them that we would like for our cemeteries to be open for burial in the winter, if that's what you're choosing. We need to go to our towns and say we want green space made available.
Right.
So these are all sort of the details that need to be worked out. Most cemetery trustees are very interested. We have several in the state. Just last week, Springfield, New Hampshire came on. So
so it's starting to spread, which is really kind of cool to see, you know. Okay, is there anybody who wouldn't be eligible to have a green burial?
No. No. Mainly I say that because Ebola is not here.
Oh, okay.
Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah. These are the only two things really that live beyond. There's hepatitis that might live up to a week, but these are not things that we want to be cremating either. So we're going to be burying them. It's just that in a natural burial cemetery, we're going to take extra precautions. We won't have done anything in the prep room to double bag and all that kind of thing. And the state is involved in any kind of process that goes beyond your normal types of diseases and so on. You did mention something a little bit earlier that I don't think I addressed, and one is that all religions are certainly the Jewish faith, Muslim faith, and Quakers have an uninterrupted tradition of burying green. So it can be done.
Wow.
Think about who's left, who has been doing it differently, and
I think though, like that's why I find this show really super important, because people need to know that there are options. And I think that a lot of times you only find out there's an option when you're forced to make a decision, and you're overwhelmed with grief and things like that too. So you might not think of other options. And from what you're talking about, in that this is a really, really compassionate way in a lot of ways to do it, where you do have the ability to say goodbye in a different format. We're running out of time, and I just wanted to know, where's a good place for people to go to get more information and your final thoughts?
Yeah, well, my final thoughts are that there's a lot to learn about this, but don't get caught up in the details. It's a really simple, back to nature way of dealing with our own dead. And I would send people to nhfuneral.org, which is the New Hampshire Funeral Resources page. Lots of info there. You'll find the same customized for Vermont at vermontfuneral.org. So very easy to find info now.
Well, you have been such a wealth of information, and I hope more people take the time to learn about burials, green burials.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for this edition of Guided Crossings. We'll see you next time.
The subject of death and dying can be a very difficult conversation to have. Many of us avoid having the conversation because it makes us uncomfortable. We don't want to worry or upset our loved ones, and we really don't want to face tough questions or think about our own death. Having open conversations about death and dying allows us to prepare ourselves and our loved ones on how we would like to create our own end-of-life journey. On every episode of Guided Crossings, we will explore a different part of the dying process and offer suggestions on how to prepare your loved ones as well as yourself. I'm your host, Andrea Sebastyan, and this is Guided Crossings.